So the article I'm doing is about infrastructure, and I'm particularly interested in stranded investments. You know what that means?
Not really.
Well, a lot of nuclear plants that are built around the country that were never operational. Like there's one outside of Cincinnati, for example, that has been sitting there like a white elephant for a long time. That's a stranded investment.
Okay.
You know, where people have put a lot of money into something and then
It's not being used.
it's not being used. And so I'm particularly interested in your take on the whole situation in North Dakota. I've been following it just a little bit, and that looks like it might well become a stranded investment.
Well, it's hard to say. I'm not sure I would characterize it as a stranded investment. It depends on what final decision is actually made with regard to do we complete, and it's not us, of course, but does DAPL complete the pipeline based on the work they've already done, or are they going to have to abandon it? And that's really, we're waiting on a court decision to be made with regard to that. Corps of Engineers has relooked at the permit that we previously had reviewed. We looked at that to see if we missed anything. As far as I know, we haven't concluded that we've missed anything at all, but I've been out of touch for the past few days.
Because you're here in Budapest.
Right. Well, Budapest, but actually I was in Marseille,
Oh, really?
France. It was a World Water Council meeting that took place there.
Neat.
Yeah. So I'm not real sure that I wouldn't characterize it yet as a stranded investment. It just depends.
Now, what do you see the Army Corps' role there at this point? I heard that you issued some type of clearance order for December 5th. Is that true?
Well, what the Corps is doing is, of course, since it crosses the waters of the U.S., it's defined in the past several years, we issue permits. It's like building or constructing in a wetland. So we have a responsibility to issue a permit, and before issuing that permit, we have to do our investigation. We look at environmental considerations, tribal considerations, and any impact it may have on a project of ours. And so we looked at those and came to a conclusion and issued the permit, but then we were asked to take a look because some of the tribal comments were that there were impacts to them that we had not considered. So what we agreed to do was to review that, just to make sure, did we miss something, and if we did, does that affect the permit that we would otherwise issue?
So there was also a question, I think, about some sacred burial grounds that have been involved in the construction. Are you aware of those?
I'm not aware of I've heard about that. I'm not aware that that the pipeline crosses or interferes with that. But that's one of the reasons why we thought we needed to go back and take a look, is because some of the tribal comments that came back to us was just that it affects sacred burial grounds. There's been a concern about the water contamination potential because of crossing the pipeline crossing the water. So those are the kind of things that we're looking at to make sure we don't miss anything before we go back with a final decision.
Right, yeah. I understand there's millions of people downstream from where that pipeline crosses the river that depend on the river for their water. We're here at a water summit. When you are confronted with that kind of situation where waters are endangered by something like a pipeline, and lots of people depend on the waters, would you look at rerouting it? As I understood, the pipeline went through another area originally and was moved here when there was objections there
I'm
to
not
it
sure.
going through?
I'm not sure about that. I haven't followed the whole entire history of what's going on there, but certainly if we think that we're endangering the water supply, that would be part of our permit decision. Our initial permit decision was that there was no danger, there was nothing that would prevent us from issuing that permit. And I'd say, there are a number of things you can do when you take like a fuel pipeline or any other contaminant and you cross a water source. What we've done in the past, in many cases, is that you can put the pipe in a sleeve or a sleeve over sleeve. You can put multiple sleeves on it. And then you put sensors inside the sleeves themselves so that if there's some liquid that gets in the sleeve which lets you know that there's a leak, you get feedback and you can stop whatever the substance is that you're pumping, you can stop that. So there are things you can do. Certainly we're sensitive to not wanting to contaminate any water supply. Now, I'm not personally familiar with the permit and what's all included or the pipeline construction to say, what kind of sensors are included, etc. But certainly we don't want to contaminate the water supply.
Right, because that's part of your mission, is it?
Well, I was going to say, as far as when I keep saying we, of course, the Corps of Engineers is not building this pipeline. The Corps of Engineers' responsibility is to issue a permit or not
Right, I
to construct
understand.
the pipeline.
But that decision hasn't been made.
No, well, again, we had finished with our permit, but when the concerns came in about there may be some interference, there may be some things we didn't consider, we're re-looking at that permit decision, and then we would, depending on what the findings are, we'll issue a final.
Now, as I understand it, one of the groups that is camped there is on Army Corps land. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Now, is there any claims that they have to that land from prior treaties that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. I think it's federal lands, and we allowed them to actually be where they actually are.
And are you going to continue to allow them to stay there?
I can't answer that question because I don't know. I don't know of any reason why we would not allow them to be there, but I really haven't been that closely monitoring this particular project.
Oh, I see. Because there was news the other day that the Army Corps of Engineers was issuing an order to evacuate that camp, the one that's on your land, on the floodplain of the Cannonball River. And given the level of violence that's occurred there already, with the police from neighboring towns and counties that are coming out and doing things like putting tear gas on the protesters and spraying them with water cannons, that type of order could be seen as empowering them to do exactly what they've been doing and cause more injuries and possibly even deaths.
Yeah.
I know there's a young woman who's lost her arm as a result of one of those concussion grenades that has gone off, and she's in her 20s. This has changed her life. She was a peaceful protester, as have been all of the protesters there. And the level of militarized response that has been directed against them is actually really problematic. They aren't doing anything except expressing their First Amendment rights on territory that is within the United States. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I read about the same young lady that you're referring to. I didn't, you mentioned that the Corps was getting ready to issue an order to say evacuate the lands. Again, I just haven't followed it that closely to say if that's what you read of, that's fact, then that's fact. I'm not sure what our decision making was with regard to that. Certainly it was not to intentionally harm anyone. Our intent has always been to make sure that protesters or anyone in the public are out of harm's way with regard to any of that construction work or anything that takes place there. I don't know, I'm not familiar with this latest order that you're saying, or decision that you said we've made.
Yeah, if the pipeline's permit hasn't yet been completely reviewed, aren't they constructing inappropriately at this point? I think President Obama asked them to voluntarily halt construction, and they have ignored that request and have gone all the way to the river, as I understand it, and could even be drilling under the river at this point. But you're saying that your responsibility is to make sure that people stay safe and stay out of harm's way from construction. But what seems to have evolved in this case is that the people that are protesting the construction are being brutalized by militarized police that seems empowered by what I don't know to take really violent action against the protesters, endanger their lives. I've been hoping, looking at the situation, that the U.S. would intervene and stop that craziness while your review has been underway, but it's just gotten worse. And of course, it's freezing cold there.
Yeah.
So when they use water cannons against peaceful protesters in the middle of the night in 20-degree weather, they are threatening their lives.
Yeah, and I don't, that's an issue that's not a Corps of Engineers issue. The security that you're referring to, and that decision made to use whatever force is outside of our authority and jurisdiction.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah, and so.
But I'm just suggesting that the order that apparently has been made to evacuate the camps by December 5th will empower that type of action. They will see what you've said as the Army Corps of Engineers as justification for more of that type of thing. And so I'm just curious what you can do about that to help save lives that are there in that camp.
Yeah, at this point, I wouldn't comment on that because I don't want to be in conflict with what we may have said as an enterprise. And it sounds like you have more information than I do with regard to what's going on there lately. Certainly I would think that if there's actions that we could take that would help prevent some of the, I'll say, security that's taking place up there, we certainly would. But I'm not aware of us doing something intentionally that's going to cause, as you said, violence to take place against the protesters.
Right, which it could inadvertently. I know for my part, I've been a permit authority myself, admittedly on a smaller level than you are.
Right.
And these kind of conflicts are normal for any permit that's issued.
Well, permit actions are always difficult. As you've been a permitter, then you understand that because almost any decision you make, there are two sides to each. To the issue. So what we try to do is to consider all aspects and consider the law before we actually issue a permit. And again, that's why when the protesters said, or you didn't consider all aspects of this permit, that we agreed we'll take another look at that. And as far as I know, that's what we were doing.
Now, does the Army Corps of Engineers ever engage in what you might call proactive conflict management in a situation like this, to try and use alternative means to get all the sides to the table and come up with a reasonable solution?
I think the Corps does that on a regular basis. I mean, we have public hearings before we take actions, whether that's actions that we would take or requests by others for permits, that we typically hold public hearings and in many cases just to try and get information to make sure we hadn't missed anything.
Right, public hearings are one thing, but actually going to mediation or engaging people in conflict management techniques that could help reduce the level of conflict in that area might be really something to consider. I know that I engaged in that a lot as a permitter, getting mediators in to sit down with people, and sometimes those conversations took a long time and delayed a project, there's no question, but in this case, delaying the project some while you engaged in some proactive conflict management rather than violence and death, which is actually, I think, quite likely there right now, I think might work better. It might help diffuse the situation, get people out of harm's way, and maybe find another way to do this pipeline, another route that doesn't take it across a drinking water supply for 4 million people downstream. It doesn't seem unreasonable.
Yeah, I'd say that, if there's an opportunity or, I think we're waiting, I can't recall, but there's a court decision that's also pending with regard to this pipeline, whether or not.
Do you know what the issue is? I haven't heard of the court case.
I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and read, and if I'd known I was going to run into you, maybe I would have read on some of this information. But I think we're waiting on a decision. Maybe not the Corps of Engineers, but for DAPL to continue with that pipeline or not. I would agree with you that we need to do everything we can to avoid violence, to avoid harming, for instance, someone's cultural territories and certainly try and make sure you do that in a nonviolent way. But I'm not real certain at this point. In fact, I'm not certain at all as to what the current status is
Of the court case.
of the court or the. I'm thinking we haven't made a final decision. You're telling me that we did, and it's too.
Well, I don't know about the permit. I do know what I've heard about the evacuation order. And there's, I think, something like 10,000 people living in that region right now.
Yeah.
Who have gone there to protect even the people that are protecting what the waters. And so if people understand that the Army Corps has issued an evacuation order, those mercenaries that are working there now, because they're really there as security for the corporations, are they not? These sheriffs and other people that are using the violent techniques against the protesters, they're not there as law enforcement officials in the sense of protecting the public. They're protecting the corporation's interests. Isn't that true?
I don't know. What I say to you is the same thing I said earlier. There's always two sides to everything. Now, the fact that it's cold in the area and people could be exposing themselves to, well, you're saying killed. What I'm getting at is just exposed to those temperatures. That there may be. The other side of that coin is let's make sure people are not out there camping out where they're exposed to the temperatures, and let's get them out of that area to be someplace warmer and safer. That doesn't mean that the protests stop. That just simply means that perhaps a better way is to not have people exposed to the elements that are out there. So I don't know. You seem to already sort of have an opinion that these law enforcers are out there to just you keep saying harm or kill the protesters. I'm not going there because that's not something I'm willing to agree that that's the intent.
So spraying water cannons in the middle of the night in 20-degree temperatures at people.
That's not my. That's not for me to comment on. The Corps of Engineers is not spraying any.
Oh, I know. But the police, the sheriffs, I believe they're hired by the companies. They're not there as law enforcement.
I don't know.
They're there on hire, like you hire a sheriff to monitor your parade.
Well, in that case, maybe you might need to be talking, if you already hadn't, talked with them to find out what their intent is or why they did that. That's not certainly something that we promoted or encouraged or requested.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
I understand that it's not something that our law enforcement officials are dealing with. You would think our law enforcement officials might be concerned with people's safety, not necessarily clearing protesters out of an area where they're peacefully protesting. I've been curious as to why there hasn't been more law enforcement showing up in defense of the protesters. Now apparently there are veterans mobilized all across the country, including Tulsi Gabbard, as you might have heard, who are going there to stand on the side of the people who are protesting the pipeline. So it's accelerating, it's escalating, and you are in a unique position to do something to lower the tensions, to change the situation, to protect people's health and safety.
Well, when you say we're in a position to do that, so if you are a permit requester, and in our case, Corps of Engineers, and I'll just use facetious numbers, I've got 10 things that I need to check to make sure that that permit doesn't violate any of those 10 things. When I check those, there's a requirement then that I respond to that permit request. That's our responsibility. Did you meet those requirements or not? If you met those requirements, then we're just as guilty if we say we're not going to issue it because we think we shouldn't because it's going to cause problems. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to make sure you satisfy the permit requirements. I think it's a much larger issue when you start saying, even though it satisfies permit requirements, even though if it crosses a water source, that you can take precautions to make sure that there is no contamination. Even if all of those things, you do all those things, someone still thinks you shouldn't issue a permit. That's not, I don't think that's our responsibility to do that. We're hired, or the Corps of Engineers authority is to make sure that we look at the waters of the U.S. and don't do harm to those.
No, I understand.
So yeah, but my point is that you keep saying we're in a unique position. So
Well, I think
you
what
know,
I was referring to was the camp and the land and
Okay,
the evacuation order. That's the place that you are in a unique position. They're on your land. It's right near the place the drilling has occurred. And the people are saying that the Army Corps of Engineers has said that the camp will be cleared by December 5th.
Okay,
That's the news that's out there. And that's what people are reacting to. Both the people that are now heading for Standing Rock to protect the people that are there and the militarized police that are on the other side of it. That's where you're in a unique position, I think, to say, call off the dogs. Please keep this camp safe. Stop the militarized response to these peaceful protesters. If you said that would help a lot, I think.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's something that I would need to check back with my office to see exactly where we are between my headquarters office and the Assistant Secretary of the Army. It's just not one of those things, as I said before, that I've personally been following.
Okay.
So
I understand.
I can't respond to that. Yeah.
I'm just hoping that you do.
Yeah. No, I'll check
And the other thing about the permit, of course, in any permit review, there is a requirement by the Environmental Protection Agency that any permit that goes across federal property or involves federal funds has to exhaust all of the potential alternatives before a permit is granted to do something like cross a water supply for 4 million people downstream. As I understand it, there are alternatives in this case for the pipeline to go elsewhere besides crossing this area. And in addition to the question of whether their sacred lands have been impacted by the pipeline, as I understand they have been already, there is that question that needs to be looked at about the alternatives for the pipeline to go different places.
Okay, so my understanding is we haven't found any evidence of any impacts to sacred land. So that's not something I would say that I agree with you on, but I do need something I'll go back and check. But that's
How about
my understanding.
alternative routes
Yeah,
or alternatives to this
there are
technology?
always alternatives. I mean, you can go around the mountain as opposed to go through it.
Right.
So there are always alternatives. It just depends on what those alternatives are and what the impacts if you don't use those alternatives are. So I would think that was part of our permit review and investigation before we actually issued that initial permit. We checked that.
Because as I've heard, there was another route that was planned for this pipeline. And that, of course, doesn't erase the issue of the pipeline in general. I mean, in addition to the threat to the waters, of course, increased fossil fuel use is a threat to the climate. And so a lot of the people that are there are objecting to the pipeline for those reasons, which I realize is probably beyond your purview, given your mandate to protect the waters. But protecting the waters is still an important part of your mandate.
Well, that's in large part, I think, a key topic of this whole forum that we're in here right now, which is integrated water resource management that we as a nation, I think, have, and maybe as a world, need to better understand how to look at those different impacts. There's almost nothing that you do that stands alone or by itself as an action.
So as a nation, you were saying?
Well, I'm saying as a nation and maybe as a world, integrated water resource management is something that requires us to look beyond, just one or two things. I mean, almost anything we do affects a much larger area, affects several different aspects of business or the environment. You put in a reservoir and there are impacts to fish and habitat. There's impact to people's energy. There are impacts to recreation. So, when you start talking about, the carbon impacts, this pipeline, there are impacts that we haven't probably understood all of the maybe secondary and tertiary impacts of actions that are taken. I think as I listen to this conference and go to different sessions, what I'll call integrated water resource management is a challenge that no country based on what I'm hearing, has figured out. We all understand it's a challenge. We all understand it's something that needs to be done, but it's not something that anyone has said, this is how you do it.
Right, although we do have evidence that fossil fuels are causing
Oh, sure.
climate change, and that climate change has a really important and deleterious impact on water all over the world. That's what I've been hearing at this conference. I've been here for the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, the guy from Tajikistan yesterday was talking about how record heat last year melted the glaciers that they depend on for both their water supply and their power supply. So our continued exploitation and use of fossil fuels and expansion of that use, like this pipeline represents, I think you could argue, represents a clear and present danger for the waters of this world and the people and the nature. And I've had a lot of faith. I've depended on the Army Corps of Engineers in the past to intervene in wetlands cases where I've been trying to protect the wetlands, and the fact that you guys have the jurisdiction there and have been able to step in and say, yeah, you can't build that here, has been an important part, at least of my life as a permit person. And I think you have a chance in this case.
Well, what you're referring to as saying we have a chance is you're talking about whether we say evacuate our land or not. I think we looked at the permit once. We're looking at it twice just to review. I don't know that I could comment on anything else that we need to do at this point.
Do you know anybody that's out there in Standing Rock?
I mean, our district.
Your district.
District is out there. The district commander.
Do you know any of the people that are there?
Do I personally? No.
I do. I know about 30 people that are there, and I am genuinely worried about their safety. And the order that I heard coming from the Army Corps of Engineers seems to me to be a real encouragement for the kind of violence that's been going on there. And so I would just ask you again to get back to your office, call them, find out if that order has been issued, and see if you can do something to stop it from going forward. They need to stay there in that camp until this issue is resolved. And I'd also offer, as somebody that has used and been called to use conflict resolution skills in these type of cases, that I'd offer my services and assistance finding other services to get people to the table and talk about this in different ways. Because right now it seems like it's a clash of cultures almost. And it doesn't need to be that. This is not the end of the world. Regardless of what happens, their lives might be lost. So I'm begging you to do something about that.
As I said before, I will contact the office and see what we're doing. Your information is a little more recent than my information, so I'll check on it.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.